In 1804, when Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set across the continent, the West was uncharted territory. It took their party of 30 men and a young girl named Sacagawea a year and a half to reach the Pacific Ocean. Since then, generations of Americans have retraced their path, among them filmmaker Ken Burns and author Dayton Duncan. Their new documentary is called Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Corps of Discovery. The two-part film airs on PBS Tuesday and Wednesday night, and I am pleased to have them here to give us a preview of what you will see on PBS. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Tell me about Ambrose Says, Stephen Ambrose, who joined you on this and who done it before, said America's appetite for Lewis and Clark is unlimited. Give us a primer on these two. I'll start with you, and what it is about them and what they did that is so compelling.
Well, first of all, they went out on the best...
And I'll be back in 30 minutes.
Exactly. First of all, they went out on the best road trip in American history, the most important expedition in American history. It's a story of friendship, which we can't get enough of. They're authentic heroes, which we're starved for today. And what they transverse is the largest museum in the world, 4,000 miles from St. Louis, Missouri to Astoria, Oregon, and it's still there.
The largest museum or the largest zoo?
Well, it's probably both. Less of a zoo now, but it's there, and you can take the diaries out and do it. And there's something about Lewis and Clark that gets under your skin. To me, it was just, you know, grade school history that you forgot until I met Dayton, and suddenly I went, my goodness, this is a story.
Tell me who each was and how they are different.
Well, Lewis was the private secretary to President Jefferson. The two of them were living together in the White House for 2.5 years. Jefferson had always wanted to send an American expedition across the continent, and he turned to Lewis to do it.
Just to interrupt, the relationship went back before the White House to
Meriwether Lewis
Monticello
grew up
and...
in the shadow of Monticello and was a family friend of Jefferson's, who asked him to be his private secretary when he became president.
And Clark?
Clark had gotten to know Lewis in the Army, had once commanded Lewis, and they'd become friends. And Lewis suffered what Jefferson called occasional depressions of the mind. And some people didn't think that he might be the right person to lead an important expedition, but he knew, I think, that he needed a helpmate. And he turned to William Clark, who turned out to be the perfect choice.
Why?
They complemented each other. Lewis was brilliant, sometimes moody. Clark was gregarious, a natural-born map maker, and the two finally got so that they would reach the same decisions, even though one might be 20 miles out ahead of the rest of them. Their trust in each other was complete. They broke all military protocol by sharing command. That was against all the rules of the military, but by doing it, I think it made it successful. There would not have been a Lewis expedition that we would be celebrating the 200th anniversary of, and I don't think there would
have been there.
If Clark had not been there, and I doubt that we'd be celebrating a Clark expedition. It required the two of them.
But it was the driven dream of Thomas Jefferson that led the expedition.
It begins in his mind, in Jefferson's mind, and his hand is omnipresent through it. He wrote out instructions to Meriwether Lewis that go on for pages about study the flora and the fauna. They wrote down descriptions of 122 animals and 178 plants that had never before been described for science. He said, study the Indians. What are their languages? What are their customs? What are the trade possibilities? What is the geography like? He was an omnivore for information, and he sent them out to find that out, and he wrote out meticulous plans for them.
The journey goes from St. Louis to the Pacific.
Exactly.
And back.
And back.
Yeah. So what's so important about what they did?
When they set off, we were a seaboard collection of former colonies clinging to the Atlantic Ocean. We lived in an area where trees covered everything. When they came back, we were well on our way to being a continental nation, poised for world domination. I mean, we were going to become the preeminent power in the world because of what they saw. The Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the magnificent resources, and just geopolitically, we had set a pick that would push out eventually Spain and Britain from any real claim to North America.
Who was on the Corps of Discovery?
The Corps of Discovery was nearly 46 men, frontiersmen, unmarried men from New Hampshire and Pennsylvania and Virginia. They were carpenters and blacksmiths and farm boys. They had a love of the wilderness. They were completely undisciplined at first, and they molded themselves as they moved along. We tend to think of Lewis and Clark as two guys, a dog, and an Indian woman, but they moved along as a group of nearly 46 men, becoming a family as they went along. They were undisciplined. They needed the lash applied for drunkenness and rowdiness and things like that, but they came together.
At the end, what happens to Clark?
Clark is really the expedition makes him. He becomes the Indian agent, the government's representative in the West, in the Louisiana Territory, headquartered in St. Louis. He has fabulous relations with the Indian tribes. They even some tribes call the St. Louis the Red-Headed Chief's Town after Clark. And he dies at a ripe old age of 69, and in the house of his son, Meriwether Lewis.
And what happened to Lewis?
Lewis, like some astronauts in our modern time, upon re-entry into the known world,
Found it tough going.
Found it tough going. He fell apart. Those depressions of the mind that Jefferson had noted in him earlier really started to crowd in on him. He took to drinking too much. He speculated in land unsuccessfully. He couldn't find someone to marry him. As the governor of the new Louisiana Territory, paperwork piled up, and finally he headed back to Washington, D.C. to try to clear up some discrepancies in the books, and met a tragic end at which virtually the last thing that he said to his servant was that Clark would be coming to rescue him from the inner demons that were crowding in around him. It's a very bittersweet story. It tells us, I think, a lesson we need to be reminded of, which is that heroes can have flaws, that people who have problems are still capable of doing great and heroic things, and Meriwether Lewis is all of that and more.
Why is it that you and Ambrose, all of you, almost come to tears, not here, talking about this? Are you so invested in and so caught up in the journey, the power of the personality, that the sheer notion of them killing themselves?
Yeah. It's the thing about this journey that makes it accessible to Americans today and that hooked me in the first place are the journals. The first-person account of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and these other men telling you in their own words all the things that they saw and they did.
Go ahead.
Meriwether Lewis, I have traveled the Lewis and Clark Trail 4 times now with Meriwether Lewis because of the written record. I've been to places, I've read his journals and looked up in Montana on the White Cliffs and seen precisely what he saw. So I've gotten to know him, and when his life comes to a tragic end, it's like a friend dying.
It's like you and Lincoln.
Exactly.
In the Civil War.
I mean, it's Faulkner again. What we talked about before is that good history is not was, but is. And if you feel it and you've got these diaries and you're there, you are there, and these people become part of your family. If you spend 4 years, as we have, making this film and going out on the trail, and as Dayton says, reading at the precise moment when they were there, it gets mixed up.
Roll tape. This is Grandfather's spirit traveling up the Missouri River. Here it is.
Big keelboat was rammed by drifting logs, got stuck on sandbars, had its mast snapped by overhanging trees. Often the only way to proceed was for the men to wade along the muddy banks and pull the boat with a rope.
The Missouri River was a big, broad, wild, tough river in those days. They'd get up in the morning, and then they'd have to get this big, heavy keelboat. It had tons and tons of supplies in it. They had to get it against the current. Current's going 5-6 miles an hour, just pushing them, trying to push them back to the Mississippi. And every day they got to go a little bit farther.
14 miles was a good day's progress But after 2 long months, they were still in what is now Missouri.
Here's what... Civil War, you had all those photographs. You ain't no camera in 1805.
I know. The real tragedy of Lewis and Clark.
They got no camera.
They got no pictures. No pictures.
But you got a river. You got a diary. But also you got dams and smokestacks.
Well,
and
this is
houses and everything else.
This has been one of the most satisfying productions because we had this obvious deficit. What do you do when there's no pictures, and what do you do with a country that's industrialized for 2 centuries after these guys go through? But it forced us to go back and find those places that Lewis and Clark saw. And sometimes it's not precisely where they saw it, because the river's impounded by a dam, and so the only free place where you can see the banks caving in is between Vermilion, South Dakota, and Yankton, South Dakota. Maybe there's a hydroelectric dam over the Great Falls in Montana, but it's rushing hard this spring and we can get it. And so we just patiently waited in every season, in every time of day and night, from every vantage, and we saw what they saw. I mean, it took a lot of looking between the fence lines and the power cuts and the missile sites. You know, sometimes we were the only people out there on the back roads trying to find the view of the bluffs of the Missouri, were the Suburbans, the black Suburbans of the missile silo crewmen.
You invited friends to come. You invited me to come and join you. Brokaw came.
We missed you.
You had people would join you.
Yeah.
What was the joy of doing? You've done this 4 times. What was the joy of doing it?
This is seeing our...
Forget the filming of it, just being there and retracing.
That's exactly right. Look, we took a busman's holiday this past summer and fall because we went back to these places that we'd been before. GM said, you know, it's been 10 years we've underwritten you. What do you want, a party? And we said, no, let's go back along the trail and say thank you to the people that had helped us make it. Because the story of Lewis and Clark is help along the way. So we took some friends along and we just had a party along the way. And what it is it's a connection to the land. We live a life that's so fast, we fly over that and we go, yep, big country. But it's only a big country when it takes you an hour to drive from one town in Montana to the next. That's a big country.
Was there any sense that now that they've done this, America has no place to go and it will wither up because it has no great challenge?
Well, I mean, we make the reference in our film of the connection, the analogies between Lewis and Clark and the space program. Right. There's plenty of them. It was decided to do it to try to, in an international race to find a Northwest Passage versus international race to the moon, staffed by the military, a lot of science, a lot of commerce involved in it. So I think what they still tell us 2 centuries later is that all of us face uncertain horizons when we get up every morning, whether we're a nation or an individual. And the 3 most prominent words in their journals are this: we proceeded on. And they crossed this big, broad continent. They're the first American citizens to find out how big it was at 14 miles a day, because we proceeded on. Every morning they got up to face an uncertain horizon, in bad weather, bugs, everything else, and they just got up and slogged on a little bit further.
Thank God all of that was gone when you did it, too.
Oh, no.
No more bad weather, no more bugs.
We have a few million chigger bites that we'd like to show you.
Tell me about York. Tell me about York, who was a
One
slave.
of the members of the expedition was William Clark's slave, whom he had owned since childhood, York. As they left the St. Louis area, for York, going west was going into a new land of relative freedom. Many of the Indian tribes had seen white people before, but few of them had ever seen a black person before. And for York, his color, rather than distinguish him as something lesser, with many of the native peoples, his color distinguished him as something more.
Roll tape. Here it is.
Those Indians were much astonished at my servant. They never saw a black man before. All flocked around him and examined him from top to toe.
To the Americans, York was a slave. To the Indians, he was big medicine.
And I remember my father telling me about the story, taking dirt and try to go up to him and rub that black off. And when they found out they couldn't rub it off, that he was a man. Of course, he was very muscular, and he was a big man apparently. And so they had a lot of respect for that.
After all of this, what's the most important thing to know about Lewis and Clark?
It's that they couldn't have made it unless without each other, and expanded that to a larger, without the two of them, without the whole group, diverse group of a slave, an Indian woman, French Canadians, rowdy frontiersmen. It required them to work together in order to succeed, and it required them as a community to have the help of people already living along the route that they traveled. That's been often forgotten. But they could not have made it. If it had been an unpeopled wilderness, they would not have made it.
When was it the bleakest for them?
Oh, without question, when they were crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, because these were mountains that weren't supposed to be there in the first place. I mean, Thomas Jefferson thought when they left that the Blue Ridge Mountains were probably the highest mountains on the North American continent. Oops. Turned out that there are these things called the Rockies.
About 6,000 or 7,000 feet.
Right. And there are these mountains that are out there that are 14,000 feet. And they thought they'd just be a narrow ridge, and you could bring your canoes up to the headwaters of the Missouri, pull them out half a day, put them into another river, off to the Pacific. And then they ran into the Rockies.
I want to get as many of these clips as I can. Sacagawea.
Sacagawea is a Shoshone girl kidnapped as a young girl by the Hidatsa Indians. There she's bought, married to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trader. And when Lewis and Clark spend the winter of 1804-5 at the Mandan villages in what is now North Dakota, they hire Charbonneau, knowing she'll come along, because they know when they get to these mountains, they're going to need to get horses from the Shoshones, and there's somebody who speaks Shoshone, and she proves invaluable.
Roll tape.
There were just 33 members of the party now, including the young Shoshone woman, Sacagawea. She dug for prairie turnips and artichokes, picked wild licorice and berries for the captain's dinners. And with her was her infant son, Jean-Baptiste, whom the men called Little Pump.
And she brought a woman's touch to this expedition. I like to think that as she was nursing Pomp at night around the campfire, that scene had to have had a great effect on the men. To hear a woman's laugh at night around the campfire bolstered spirits.
Okay, one last clip. We're going to run one last clip in which set this up for you. This is where Patricia Glass, this is where Lewis encounters an endless path of mountains, which he calls visionary enlightenment.
Enchantment. Scenes of visionary enchantment. This is the White Cliffs in central Montana. It is, to this moment, the closest to what Lewis and Clark saw of any place along the trail. It's the most protected area, and we went back there. They were blown away by what they see. Nobody had prepared them for the majesty of this landscape, either the Great Plains, the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the salmon teeming in the Columbia, or this beautiful stretch of the Missouri River in what is now central Montana.
The single most enchanting place for you on the trip?
It's this place. This
for
is
you too.
Me too.
This is the most unchanged portion where you read Lewis's journal today, look up, and it is
we could only get there by canoe, and it's a several-day affair to get there. And as filmmakers, we slept in tents and suffered as they suffered and marveled as they marveled.
Roll tape. Here it is.
We passed some very curious cliffs and rocky peaks in a long range, some of them 200 feet high and not more than 8 feet thick. They seem as if built by the hand of man, and are so numerous that they appear like the ruins of an ancient city.
As we passed on, it seemed as if those scenes of visionary enchantment would never have an end. Meriwether Lewis.
My thanks to Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns. There are a couple of books that go along with this. One, Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Corps of Discovery, and Dayton's book, Out West, An American Journey Along the Lewis and Clark Trail. This is on PBS Tuesday and Wednesday night. An enchanting trip taken by Lewis and Clark, 1805.
1804, 1805, 1806.
1806. Thank you both.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Part 2 of our conversation with the eminent historian, John Hope.